This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Washington, D.C., where history is being made today. In a major diplomatic thaw, Cuba will raise its flag here and officially reopen its embassy after 54 years. Hundreds are gathering for this historic moment, including U.S. and Cuban lawmakers and diplomats, activists and artists, scholars and historians. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez is leading a delegation of over 24 officials from Havana, including Cuba's chief negotiator, Josefina Vidal. Also among the attendees is Cuban singer-songwriter Sylvia Rodriguez and former Parliament President Ricardo Alarcón. This afternoon, Rodriguez will hold a joint news conference with Secretary of State John Kerry at the State Department, where Cuba's flag was raised earlier this morning, joining the flags of more than 150 other countries that have diplomatic relations with the United States. In Havana, the U.S. Embassy will also reopen its doors today. Kerry is set to travel there later this summer for the formal inauguration ceremony, where the U.S. flag will be hoisted. Cubans have welcomed the diplomatic rapprochement with jubilation. This is Professor Alberto Matos.
For us, this is significant. It's important. I think it's a decisive step towards normalizing relations. In other words, as Cubans, we celebrate this and are waiting to see what could happen and what could continue from this point on, which we are optimistic will be things that are feasible for the Cuban people and the people of the United States.
The Cuban embassy, which I am standing just across the street from, was built in 1917, almost 100 years ago, becoming the first diplomatic building in this neighborhood and helping to establish this area as a diplomatic center. Fidel Castro visited the embassy in 1959 after he overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. 2 years later, in 1961, the United States unilaterally broke off relations with Cuba. The last time the United States and Cuba had diplomatic ties, President Dwight Eisenhower was in office. Today's opening of embassies is just the first step in normalizing relationships between the two countries. On Wednesday, Cuban President Raul Castro applauded the diplomatic renewal, but called on President Obama to use his executive powers to remove the ongoing U.S. trade and financial embargo.
The revolutionary government has the willingness to advance in normalizing relations, convinced that both countries can cooperate and coexist in a civilized manner, for mutual benefit beyond differences that we have and that we will have, and contribute to peace. We hope that the U.S. President continues to use his executive powers that he can use as President without congressional interference to dismantle aspects of this policy that has damaged and caused hardship to our people.
That was Cuban President Raul Castro. So far, the Republican majority in Congress has rejected President Obama's calls to lift the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Obama's congressional opponents have also vowed to block any ambassadorial nominee to Cuba and have denounced the decision to formally remove Cuba from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. Today, 3 Cuban-American lawmakers, Florida Republican Representatives Mario Diaz-Balart, Carlos Curbelo, and Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, are holding a news conference in Miami. Ros-Lehtinen told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "Allowing the opening of the Cuban embassy in Washington is nothing but another indefensible capitulation by the Obama administration to an avowed enemy of the U.S." Meanwhile, White House spokesperson Josh Earnest has dismissed such opponents as a vocal minority with entrenched partisan interests. Speaking Friday, Earnest said U.S. restoration of relations with Cuba has strong support in Congress.
There exists bipartisan support for advancing the policy that the President announced to normalize our relations with Cuba. But there have been some entrenched partisan interests that have tried to block this in Congress so far. Fortunately, there are a number of steps that the President can take using his executive authority to begin to make these changes. The President is implementing these changes because he believes it's in the broader strategic interest of the United States.
For more we're joined now by Jose Pertierra. He is a Cuban attorney based in Washington, D.C., who represented Elian Gonzalez in 2000, 2001. He also represented the Venezuelan government in his efforts to extradite Luis Posada Carriles. And we're joined by Peter Kornbluh, who directs the Cuba Documentation Project at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. He's the co-author of the book Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, an updated version of the book that tells the secret story of how Obama used back-channel diplomacy to normalize diplomatic relations, and particularly looks at the role of the Pope in the back-channel negotiations. Will be published in September. Jose Pertierra and Peter Kornbluh, it's so good to have you with us on this truly historic day. People who are watching, listening right now, hear all the traffic. We're right across the street from the Cuban embassy, which will soon hoist the Cuban flag for the first time in Washington, D.C., on the Cuban embassy grounds in 54 years. Jose Pertierra, you're a Cuban American. Talk about the significance of this.
Oh, this is very significant. This is historic. I waited for this moment all my life. In 1961, I was 10 years old, and I remember as if it was yesterday when diplomatic relations were broken. There were times when I thought I'd never live to see the day. And now that you mentioned flags, Amy, it's interesting. There's going to be a new Cuban flag hoisted in this flagpole across the street. But inside the embassy, they are going to hoist the flag that the Cuban government took back to Cuba when on January 3rd, 1961, Dwight Eisenhower broke relations. That flag was folded, taken back to Cuba and put in a museum in Las Tunas, and it has been brought back, and it will be flying inside the embassy today.
Why did Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, cut off relations?
Well, the United States, I think, has had a problem, as you know, and this show has presented to the world knowledge of that. The United States feels that it owns a large part of Latin America, and it was very hard for the United States to stomach a revolution that set Cuba as an independent and sovereign country, and set an example for the rest of Latin America. I think really there were a lot of reasons, but that really was at the time the reason, and has been the reason why diplomatic relations have not been restored until President Obama did so on December 17th.
Peter Kornbluh, can you weigh in on that?
Well, I can weigh in a little bit, but I just want to say thank you for having us here on this momentous day. There are a lot of people that never really thought they'd live to see today come, and so many people have worked for this day to arrive, and here it is right now. You know, the more sinister reason that Eisenhower broke relations was because the United States was preparing to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and Fidel Castro had his intelligence agents in Central America reporting on these preparations, and he decided he wasn't going to let the U.S. Embassy be a nest of spies, as he put it, and he was going to tell the United States they had to remove almost, I don't know, I think 70% of the embassy personnel, cut the embassy way down so that it wouldn't be a center of this espionage and preparations for the attack. And Eisenhower seized the opportunity of Fidel expelling all of these people who were, in fact, working to overthrow the Cuban government. He seized on that opportunity as a public relations kind of hook to say, well, we can't take this insult. We're just going to break relations with Cuba. Things have changed in the 54 years since. And now the real work begins, I think, to actually normalize overall relations beyond just diplomatic relations.
Because let's be clear, the embargo has not been lifted, and that would have to go through Congress. Is that right, Jose Pertierra? Is there any other way?
Well, the president has a great deal of authority under the Constitution to further relax the restrictions of the embargo. But you're right, Amy, the embargo was codified by President Clinton in a move that it seems unfathomable that a president would make, that stripped not only his powers, but the power of future presidents to, by executive order, lift restrictions against Cuba. They codified it, and it's sitting in Congress, and it's very difficult to do it when you have a Republican majority Congress, especially a Republican Party that has gone off the cliff in the last few years.
I think what President Obama is trying to do is use his executive powers to poke holes in this dam that is the U.S. embargo. And the holes are going to grow bigger and bigger as the kind of economic waters and cultural, social waters of the U.S. interests, various interests, the people's interests, musicians' interests.
Silvio Rodriguez is part of the official delegation,
exactly,
the great Cuban musician.
And certainly economic interests. There are quite a few corporations and the hotel industry, the shipping industry, the Carnival cruise industry that would like to get into Cuba. And as they rush through the holes in the dam that Obama has created, the dam that is the embargo, I think is going to erode and eventually collapse. And you're going to have Republicans saying, yeah, I think it doesn't make sense to restrict trade with Cuba.
The business of America is business, isn't that what they say?
I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been pushing for the
Carlos
lifting of the
Gutierrez, who was Secretary of Commerce under Bush, has come out in favor of the lifting of the blockade. So yeah, it's a tidal wave.
Because of course, business has no politics in the end. It's there to make money, and people see opportunities in Cuba. So, but the point is that we can make great strides towards better relations and normal relations with Cuba, even with the embargo in place. I think we have to be patient about that. There are a lot of other serious issues, actually, that Cuba and the United States are going to be discussing from this day onward. Compensation for expropriated property, the whole issue of Guantanamo, the USAID programs that are focused on promoting democracy in Cuba that are a great insult to Cuba's sovereignty. These are things that going forward are still going to be under discussion, but let me just say, they're going to be under discussion under a different framework of relations, a framework of normal, non-hostile civil ties.
We're going to go to break and then come back. We'll continue with Jose Perchera, learn about his story, how he came to the United States with his family from Cuba, representing Elian Gonzalez and also representing the Venezuelan government in efforts to extradite Luis Posada Cadiles, who still lives today in Florida. And Peter Kornblue, also joining us, the head of the Cuba Documentation Project National Security Archive, co-author of the book Back Channel to Cuba. We'll be joined by Danny Glover and longtime activist Medea Benjamin. They are holding Medea Benjamin and Code Pink, a party outside the embassy today that will go throughout the day and the afternoon. Meanwhile, inside the embassy, 700 people will gather as the flag is hoisted for the first time, the Cuban flag on the Cuban embassy property in 54 years. Stay with us.
Aunque no cabe el peso de su extraña gracia y brinda por la muerte de su abril. Después se sube un sitio inexpugnable y canta un canto que suena agradable mientras por dentro vuelve a maldecir. El hombre riega de su única tierra, de su propio enemigo en esta nueva guerra. El hombre vio su rostro sucumbir. Quizá ahora hoy en la casa de la historia que se revise el trono de la gloria, porque un hombre sin rostro va a morir.
Yes, that is Silvio Rodriguez. Silvio Rodriguez is part of the official Cuban delegation today that is led by Bruno Rodriguez, the Cuban foreign minister, who will be here at the embassy honoring the opening of the Cuban embassy and the hoisting of the Cuban flag in Washington, D.C. Our guests now, coming up, Medea Benjamin and actor Danny Glover, long an activist on the issue of Cuba, are Jose Perchera, Cuban attorney here in Washington, D.C., represented Elian Gonzalez, and also represented the Venezuelan government in its efforts to extradite Luis Posada Cadiles. Peter Kornblue is also with us, directs the Cuba Documentation Project, the National Security Archive. If you would talk, Jose, about how you came to this country.
Amy, my mother fled Cuba with my father, but she was fleeing from her mother-in-law, not from the revolution. She hated her mother-in-law. And she convinced my father to leave Cuba. We arrived in Miami, as so many Cubans do, and at the time there was a program in Miami run by the United States government for Cuban refugees, and they would fly a Cuban family to live anywhere in the United States. They'd give them a one-way ticket as long as they promised not to live in Miami. I guess they were worried, even back in 1961, of what would happen to Miami if Cuban Americans stayed there. And so we went to California and Los Angeles. And I grew up with the philosophy of Cesar Chavez instead of Jorge Mascanosa. I think.
And Jorge Mascanosa, for those who don't know or remember,
is the leader of the president of the Cuban American National Foundation, very right-wing extremist guy who was a friend of Reagan and Bush and so forth. And I think that my mother's move to California saved my life. Otherwise, I'd have grown up in Miami.
You have two cigars. You're holding one.
I'm holding one.
And this one.
And you've got one in your pocket. The significance of these cigars. Are they legal right now?
Yes, they're legal if you bring, you can bring $100 worth of cigars into the United States from Cuba, but you can't bring them in from a third country. You have to bring them in directly from Cuba.
Peter Cornwall.
More and more, Americans are traveling to Cuba now because Obama has said that he has lifted some of the restrictions on travel, made it easier to travel, but there's still an overall law against free travel to Cuba, and that is one of the things that absolutely has to change if we're going to have normal relations, and if U.S. citizens are going to be able to exercise their constitutional freedoms to go wherever they want. Cuba is really the only country now that we are restricted from vacationing in. But more and more American citizens are going, U.S. citizens, they're buying cigars, drinking rum, listening to the music.
And there are direct flights.
Can
you explain what's happening?
JetBlue is starting direct flights. There's going to be the Carnival Cruise Line is actually going to start going to Cuba, but taking kind of people-to-people groups instead of vacationers. I mean, we are seeing a ferry service is starting up again. That there used to be a historic ferry service between Key West and Miami and Cuba, and now it's starting up again. I mean, you are seeing it's so fast the way it's changing, the way these two countries are becoming connected again. And it's really, really something.
Jose Pritchura, you fought for this, but you're also raising some warning flags.
I'm cautiously optimistic, Amy. I'm optimistic about the future. I think that President Obama's move in December 17 and today is irreversible, no matter who gets elected president. However, things can go wrong, and the United States needs to have a president who will exercise his presidential authority to get rid of a number of programs that are damaging to U.S.-Cuba relations, such as, for example, the regime change program that, to the tune of more than $30 million a year, seeks to change the government of Cuba. There are also things that
this is millions of dollars the U.S. government puts in to change the government.
The Congress mandates get spent on Cuba under the Helms-Burton law.
And what they do with that is they pay dissidents in Cuba and in Miami. Opposition to the Cuban Revolution in Miami is an industry. People make money and live very comfortably as a result of it. So the United States needs to get rid of those programs and move forward and respect the sovereignty of Cuba. Cuba does not belong to the United States. Maybe Mississippi does, but Cuba does not.
Luis Posada Carriles, you represent the Venezuelan government. Can you explain, Jose, who he is and his significance even today?
Luis Posada Carriles, Amy, was the Osama bin Laden of Latin America. He was responsible for a campaign of terror against Cuba dating all the way back to the late 60s, early 1970s, up until very recently. He directed a campaign of bombs in hotels and restaurants in Cuba that resulted in injuries and death.
I was in Cuba at the Copacabana Hotel after the Italian tourist was killed in one of those bombings. His father would not leave the area of the lobby where his son died.
He moved to Cuba. He told me, Justino told me, I moved to Cuba because if I live anywhere else, I feel that Fabio has died. But in Cuba, I feel his spirit. And he also, Posada Carriles was also responsible for downing an airliner with 73 people on board. Everybody was killed.
This was 1976.
Exactly, including a 9-year-old girl was murdered there.
And the entire Cuban fencing team.
And the entire Cuban youth fencing team with their medals on their chest. They had won all the gold, silver, and bronze medals at the Pan American Games.
In Venezuela.
In Venezuela. And they were flying back to Cuba singing, and these bombs went off. And the United States continues to protect this man in Miami. Him and many other Cuban exiled terrorists who live in Miami. Miami is the favorite place for Cuban terrorists to go hang out and retire. And, you know, that's something that is a problem in U.S.-Cuba relations, as is Guantanamo. Because
it's likely today there'll be a small protest in Miami, very small, and that by anti-Castro Cubans. But Luis Posada Carriles might show up, and the fact of the matter is that the United States has been harboring an international terrorist that even the CIA, FBI documents show was behind the explosion on this plane.
And you look at other moments in U.S. history, Watergate break-in, the involvement of Cuban exiles there.
The Letelier assassination down the street here.
So explain. Orlando Letelier, the Chilean diplomat, and Ronnie Moffat, his assistant.
Killed by agents of the Pinochet government working with these anti-Castro terrorists, collaborating.
That too was in 1976,
Cuban,
is that right?
That's right. The people who pushed the bomb.
And that was right here. I mean, where
right down the street.
Down on Embassy Row.
Right.
Their bomb.
There's a whole history, but
up.
let me just say, I really want to say, this history is going to be part of a past that certainly we all have to remember. As long as Posada Carriles is in this country without justice, without being prosecuted, without being extradited, that history lives on. But the United States and Cuba are poised today to move forward, to keep working on these issues of the past that include Posada Carriles and the embargo, but to move forward in a much different way. And the fact that these flags are flying, they're flying in a different wind, aren't they, Jose Pertierra? The winds of change have come to U.S.-Cuban relations, and we really can't forget that, as much and as dramatic as the past is between these two countries.
Well, Jose Pertierra, your own car was bombed, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
When was it blown up?
But that wasn't the Cubans.
Those are Guatemalans.
Those are Guatemalans. It's right here in Washington. I was representing an American, Jennifer Harper, whom you've interviewed on this program, and her husband was disappeared and tortured in Guatemala, and
Comandante Everardo.
Comandante Everardo Efraín Bamaca Velázquez is his complete name. And the Guatemalan military put a bomb in my car in the driveway about 4 miles, 3 or 4 miles from here, and it blew up. I don't think they meant to kill me because it was at 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning when it exploded, but it meant to scare me off the case. I remained on the case, and the Inter-American Court in San Jose of the OAS found the government of Guatemala culpable for the disappearance, torture of Comandante Everardo, and ordered compensation be paid to his widow, Jennifer.
So explain today, as this flag goes up, what is happening in Havana? Originally, I thought the flags were going to go up around the same time, on this same day, on July 20th, 2015. Now, the U.S. Embassy is going to open there, as is this embassy here today, but the flag won't be hoisted today.
They are waiting to hoist a flag until John Kerry can get off his crutches from having broken his leg, can get beyond the negotiations on Iran, and push those forward and find a day in August to go to Cuba and be there for that ceremony. He will become the highest ranking U.S. official to travel to Cuba since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Another major step, another major publicity attraction, another indication of a much more normal relationship with Cuba. And that is due to happen sometime in August, and I think start to create a momentum after Kerry. The Pope is going to go to Cuba in September.
And I think Obama will go to Cuba too before his presidency.
And I am sure, I'm going to predict on this show today, that one of the things that Kerry will be doing is doing some advance work for President Obama to go to Cuba, which will be his Nixon in China moment, and really, I think, consolidate these changes in policy.
I agree with Peter. That'll seal the deal. If he goes to Cuba, it'll be completely irreversible.
Jose Pertierra, you mentioned Guantanamo. It's not closing.
It's not closing, and You know,
over 100 men are still being held there.
People talk about violation of human rights and due process in Cuba, and I tell you, Amy, there is violation of human rights and due process in Cuba, and it's in Guantanamo. I mean, we're holding prisoners there for years without trial, tortured them, and President Obama took the office with a promise that he would close Guantanamo as a prison, and he has not. I think he will before his term is over, but you know, it's been 6 years, and 6 years of prison for people without trial, 6 years of torture. I think he needs to do something, but beyond that, beyond closing it as a prison, the United States needs to return that territory to Cuba. That is sovereign Cuban territory. The United States has no business there. If they want a base somewhere, they can put it in Mississippi, Alabama, but not in Cuba. Cuba belongs to Cuba, not to Washington.
It's one of the most difficult kind of political issues, I think, for the president. It's kind of last on the list and has been last on the list for all the years of discussions about how to normalize relations with Cuba in terms of kind of the ultimate priority. It's because of the difficulty in negotiating the return of Guantanamo, but eventually that will happen. Guantanamo will become the Panama Canal of Cuba. It will be returned, and kind of the last vestige of kind of physical vestige of U.S. imperialism in the region and in Cuba will be over.
So as we look behind us over the Cuban embassy, there is a flagpole that was just erected a few months ago.
That's
right. It's very shiny. There's a gold ball on top. It's ready, and in just an hour or so, there's going to be a Cuban flag waving in the wind.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us
Amy, for
again
us
on this historic day. 54 years ago, the Cuban embassy was closed. 54 years ago, the flag was pulled down. Today, it will be hoisted once again on July 20th, 2015. Peter Kornbluth, thanks for being with us, director of the Cuba Documentation Project, National Security Archive at George Washington University, co-author of the book Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. And thank you so much to Jose Pertierra. He represented Elian Gonzalez. He represented the government of Venezuela as they tried to extradite Luis Posada Cadiles, who to this day lives in Florida. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Danny Glover, who has long fought for normalization of relations with Cuba, and longtime activist, founder of Code Pink, Medea Benjamin. Stay with us.